Jake Morrison floated in the zero-gravity maintenance bay of the USS Atlantic, his hands working steadily on the communication array's power coupling. The wrench in his grip felt familiar after 5 years of deep space engineering work. Around him, the hum of the ship's life support systems created a steady background noise that most crew members found comforting. Jake had learned to listen to those sounds, knowing that any change could mean trouble. The Atlantic was 3 months into a routine exploration mission in the Outer Rim systems. Their job was simple: map new star systems, check for habitable planets, and set up communication relays for future human expansion. Jake enjoyed this work. It was peaceful compared to his earlier military service, and he got to see parts of the galaxy that no human had ever visited before. "Morrison, how's that array coming along?" Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm system. "Almost finished, Captain," Jake replied, tightening the last connection. "Should have full signal strength in about 10 minutes. "Good. We've got some strange readings on long-range sensors. Nothing to worry about, but I want our communications at full power just in case." Jake nodded, even though the captain couldn't see him. Strange readings were common in unexplored space. Usually they turned out to be nothing more than unusual asteroid formations or gas clouds. He finished his work on the array and began packing his tools. The job had taken longer than expected, but everything was working perfectly now. That's when the ship shuddered. It wasn't the gentle vibration of the engines or the slight bump of entering a gravity well. This was different. The Atlantic groaned like something massive had grabbed it and refused to let go. Jake quickly secured his tools and activated his magnetic boots, knowing that whatever was happening might affect the artificial gravity. "All hands to stations." Captain Rodriguez's voice echoed through the ship, but this time there was tension in his tone. "We have an unidentified vessel on our stern. It's big." Jake pushed off from the maintenance bay wall and glided toward the nearest viewport. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A ship outside was unlike anything in human design databases. It looked organic, almost like a massive sea creature made of dark metal and glowing blue lines. The thing had to be at least 5 times the size of the Atlantic. "Jake, get to engineering." Lieutenant Lisa Park's voice came through his personal comm. "We need all hands on deck for this one." But before Jake could move, the entire ship lurched violently. Emergency lights began flashing red, and the gravity systems flickered. Jake felt his stomach drop as he briefly experienced weightlessness before the artificial gravity kicked back in. "Hull breach in Section 7. Someone shouted over the comm system. "We're being boarded." Jake's military training kicked in immediately. He grabbed the emergency toolkit from the maintenance bay and began moving toward engineering. But he only made it halfway down the corridor before he saw them. The aliens were tall, maybe 7 feet, with pale gray skin that seemed to shimmer in the ship's lighting. They wore what looked like environmental suits, but the material seemed to move and flow like liquid metal. Their faces were hidden behind dark visors, but Jake could see that their heads were larger than human heads, with longer necks. "Don't move," one of them said, and Jake was surprised to hear the words in perfect English. The alien held some kind of device that was definitely a weapon, though it looked more like a tool than a gun. Jake raised his hands slowly. His military training told him to fight, but his engineering mind was already calculating the odds. These beings had technology far beyond human capabilities. Their ship could overpower the Atlantic without breaking a sweat, and they had somehow learned English well enough to communicate perfectly. "You are Lieutenant Jake Morrison," the alien said. It wasn't a question. "You are the primary maintenance engineer for this vessel's communication systems." "How do you know that?" Jake asked, keeping his voice steady. "We have been observing your species for some time," the alien replied. Your recent expansion into this region of space has attracted our attention. We are the Zelani Collective, and we must determine whether your species represents a threat to galactic stability. More aliens appeared in the corridor, escorting other crew members. Jake recognized Lisa Park and two other engineers, but he couldn't see Captain Rodriguez or most of the bridge crew. The aliens were separating them, taking different people in different directions. What do you want with us? Jake asked. Each of you will undergo evaluation, the alien explained as they began walking down the corridor. Your species shows remarkable technological advancement for such a young civilization. This rapid progress, combined with your territorial expansion patterns, suggests you may become a destabilizing force in this region of the galaxy. They reached a transport chamber that definitely hadn't been part of the Atlantic's original design. The walls seemed to shift and flow, and Jake realized the aliens had somehow modified the ship's structure to suit their needs. The technology required for such rapid modifications was staggering. The evaluation will test your species' limitations and problem-solving capabilities under stress, the alien continued as they entered the transport chamber. Each human will face different challenges designed to reveal the true nature of your people. And if we fail your tests, Jake asked. The alien was quiet for a moment. Then your species will be contained before it can threaten others. The transport chamber activated, and Jake felt a strange tingling sensation as the world around him shifted. When the sensation stopped, he was standing in a completely different environment. The walls were smooth and metallic, with a slight blue tint that seemed to come from the material itself rather than any lighting system. This will be your home for the duration of your evaluation, the alien said. You will have access to basic waste facilities and a small amount of water. Food will not be necessary for the length of this test. Jake looked around the chamber. It was roughly the size of a small apartment, but completely empty, except for what appeared to be a waste disposal unit in one corner and a small viewport in one wall. The air smelled clean, but somehow artificial. How long will this test last? Jake asked, but when he turned around, the alien was gone. The wall where the entrance had been was now seamless, showing no sign that there had ever been an opening. Jake was alone. He walked to the viewport and looked out. Beyond the transparent material, he could see stars, but they looked different. Somehow, either they had traveled a great distance very quickly, or the aliens had some way of altering what he could see. Either possibility demonstrated technology far beyond human understanding. The silence in the chamber was complete, except for a very faint humming, sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Jake recognized it as the sound of life support systems, though the technology was clearly alien. He took a deep breath and noticed that the air felt slightly thin, though still breathable. That's when he began to understand what kind of test this might be. Jake sat on the floor of the chamber and tried to think clearly. The air definitely felt thinner than normal, and he could feel his heart beating a little faster as his body tried to compensate. He had experienced similar feelings during high altitude training in the military, and the signs were unmistakable. The oxygen level in the chamber was dropping. He stood up and began walking around the room, examining every surface carefully. His engineering training had taught him to look for details that others might miss. The walls appeared completely smooth at first glance, but when he ran his hands across them, he could feel very slight variations in texture and temperature. Humming sound from the life support systems was getting quieter, which probably meant the systems were working less actively. Jake pressed his ear against different sections of the wall and listened carefully. The sound was strongest near the corner opposite the viewport, which suggested that's where the main atmospheric processing equipment was located. After 2 hours of careful examination, Jake estimated he had maybe 16 hours of breathable air left, possibly less if he exerted himself too much. The aliens had designed this test to see how long a human could survive in a slowly suffocating environment. They probably expected him to panic, conserve air by staying still, and eventually pass out from oxygen deprivation. But Jake wasn't planning to cooperate with their expectations. He pulled out the small toolkit he had grabbed from the maintenance bay before being captured. The aliens had either not noticed it or hadn't considered it a threat. The kit contained basic tools that any engineer would carry: a multimeter, wire strippers, a small screwdriver set, and some electrical tape. Jake began a more systematic examination of the chamber. He knew that alien technology might work differently than human systems, but engineering principles were universal. Energy had to flow from one place to another, waste had to be processed, and life support systems needed maintenance access. The waste disposal unit, he found what he was looking for. The wall panel in that area was slightly warmer than the others, and when he tapped it with his screwdriver, it made a different sound. There was hollow space behind it. Using the screwdriver and the edge of his belt buckle, Jake carefully worked. At the edges of the panel, the alien metal was strange to work with, almost like it wanted to seal itself, but he eventually managed to create a small gap. From there, he could work his fingers under the panel and pull it away from the wall. Behind the panel was a complex network of what appeared to be biological and electronic components working together. Thick cables that looked almost like plant vines carried both electrical current and some kind of fluid. Small devices that resembled computer processors were connected to what looked like living tissue. The whole system pulsed gently with a blue-green light. Jake had never seen anything like it, but he could recognize the basic patterns. This was clearly part of the atmospheric processing system. The biological components were probably filtering and processing the air, while the electronic parts controlled the flow rates and chemical balance. But what caught his attention most was something the aliens probably hadn't expected him to notice. In the damp areas around the biological processors, small patches of what looked like moss were growing. The stuff was dark green with tiny blue spots that glowed faintly in the dim light. It seemed to be thriving in the moist environment created by the atmospheric system. Jake carefully touched one of the moss patches. It felt soft and slightly warm, and he noticed that the air near it seemed fresher somehow. His engineering mind began putting the pieces together. The aliens were using biological components in their technology, and this moss was probably part of their air recycling system. It might be producing oxygen as a byproduct of its biological processes. The problem was that there wasn't nearly enough of it to sustain him. The few small patches he could see might produce enough oxygen for a mouse, but not for a full-grown human. He needed to find a way to grow more of it, and fast. Jake carefully harvested a small sample of the moss, making sure not to damage the main patches. He needed to keep the existing growth alive while trying to cultivate more. The moss felt strange in his fingers, almost like it was responding to his touch. He examined the biological processors more closely. The system was incredibly complex, but he could see that it operated on principles similar to human biotechnology. The moss seemed to be connected to the electronic components through thin filaments that carried both nutrients and electrical signals. That gave Jake an idea. He used his multimeter to test the electrical current flowing through the system. Readings were unlike anything he had seen before, with the current fluctuating in complex patterns rather than flowing steadily. But the patterns reminded him of something he had studied in advanced engineering courses: bioelectric feedback loops. The alien system was using electrical current to stimulate biological processes, and the biological components were generating electrical current in return. It was like a living computer that powered itself through metabolic processes. Jake realized that if he could tap into this system and redirect some of the electrical current, he might be able to stimulate the moss. to grow faster and produce more oxygen. It would be risky because he didn't fully understand the alien technology, but he was running out of time and options. He carefully traced the electrical pathways in the system, looking for a point where he could safely interrupt the current without damaging the critical life support functions. The aliens had built redundancy into their systems, which meant he could probably redirect power from non-essential circuits without shutting down the atmospheric processing entirely. Using his wire strippers and electrical tape, Jake began carefully modifying the alien circuitry. The materials were strange to work with, but electrical principles were the same everywhere in the universe. Current flowed from high potential to low potential, and circuits could be modified by changing the pathways. As he worked, Jake noticed that his breathing was becoming more labored. The oxygen level in the chamber was continuing to drop, and he was probably down to about 14 hours of breathable air. He needed to work faster, but he also needed to be careful not to make any mistakes that could shut down the life support system entirely. After an hour of careful work, Jake had successfully tapped into one of the secondary electrical circuits. He ran a wire from the alien system to the area where he had placed his moss sample, creating a simple electrical stimulation setup. When he activated the circuit, the moss sample began to glow more brightly, and Jake could swear he felt a slight improvement in the air quality near it. It was working, but he needed much more moss to make a real difference. Jake looked around the chamber with new eyes, planning his next moves. He had maybe 13 hours of air left, but now he had hope. Jake worked through the night, though he had no way to tell time in the windowless chamber, except by watching the slow decline of his breathing capacity. The moss sample he had electrically stimulated was definitely growing, spreading across the small area where he had placed it like a living green carpet. More importantly, the air around it felt noticeably fresher, but one small patch of moss would never be enough. Jake needed to create a much larger cultivation system, and he needed to do it with almost no resources. He began tearing strips of fabric from his uniform, starting with the inner lining that wouldn't affect the garment's structural integrity. The synthetic material would hold moisture and provide a surface for the moss to grow on. Water was his next challenge. The chamber provided a small amount of drinking water through a dispenser near the waste facility. But Jake realized he could collect additional moisture by breathing on the cool metal walls. His warm breath condensed into tiny droplets that he carefully collected using pieces of fabric. Jake spread the fabric strips along the base of the walls, creating a network of damp growing surfaces. He carefully divided his original moss sample into smaller pieces, distributing them across the fabric strips. Each piece was tiny, but if his electrical stimulation system worked properly, they should all begin growing rapidly. The real breakthrough came when Jake discovered that the alien electrical system responded to different frequencies by adjusting the current using makeshift resistors created from strips of conductive material in his uniform. He could change how the electricity affected the moss. Higher frequencies seemed to stimulate faster growth, while lower frequencies increased oxygen production. Jake spent hours experimenting with different settings, carefully monitoring the moss response while keeping track of his remaining air supply. He estimated he had about 10 hours of breathable air left, but the moss patches were growing steadily. Some were already the size of his hand, and the air quality in the chamber was definitely improving. The electrical modifications required constant attention. The alien system seemed to have some kind of self-repair mechanism that tried to undo his changes, forcing Jake to continuously monitor and adjust his improvised circuits. It was exhausting work, but he could feel that his breathing was becoming easier as more moss came online. By his calculations, Jake had been in the chamber for about 8 hours when he made his next important discovery. The moss didn't just produce oxygen randomly. It responded to carbon dioxide levels in the air. When Jake breathed near a patch of moss, it would glow brighter and seem to work harder. The plants were actually responding to his presence and trying to clean the air around him. This gave Jake another idea. He began positioning himself strategically around the chamber, spending time near different moss patches to stimulate their growth. He also started doing controlled breathing exercises he had learned in military training, both to conserve oxygen and to provide the carbon dioxide that seemed to energize the plants. The system was becoming more efficient by the hour. Jake had created a rough circle of moss patches around the chamber, each one connected to his electrical stimulation network. The patches were communicating with each other somehow, because when one patch grew larger, the others seemed to respond by growing faster as well. Jake also discovered that the moss produced different gases depending on the electrical frequency he used. Most frequencies produced oxygen, but some created other gases that he couldn't identify. He had to be careful not to poison himself while experimenting. But the knowledge helped him optimize the system for maximum oxygen production. As his improvised life support system became more sophisticated, Jake began to understand why the aliens used biological components in their technology. The living systems were incredibly adaptable and efficient. They could respond to changing conditions, repair themselves, and even improve their performance over time. It was like having a computer that could evolve. Jake had been in the chamber for about 12 hours when he realized something remarkable. He was no longer losing oxygen. His moss network was producing enough fresh air to balance what he was consuming. He had achieved equilibrium with just scraps of fabric, condensed water, and basic electrical components. But Jake wasn't satisfied with just surviving. His engineering mind was already thinking about improvements. The moss patches near the corners of the room seemed to grow better, probably because the air circulation was different there. He began relocating some of his cultivation areas to take advantage of these microclimates. He also noticed that different pieces of his uniform fabric produced different results. The synthetic materials from his undershirt seemed to hold moisture better, while the cotton from his outer uniform provided better support for moss roots. Jake began creating specialized growing environments using different fabric types. Electrical system continued to evolve as well. Jake discovered that by creating feedback loops between different moss patches, he could make the entire network more efficient. When one patch detected low oxygen levels, it could signal the others to increase production. It was like creating a primitive nervous system for his improvised life support network. By the 15th hour, Jake had transformed the sterile chamber into something resembling a small greenhouse. Green moss covered large sections of the walls, connected by a web of improvised wiring that carried both electrical current and moisture. The air was not only breathable, but actually felt fresh and clean. Jake realized he had done something the aliens probably never expected. He had not only survived their test, but actually improved the living conditions in the chamber. His hybrid biological electrical system was producing more oxygen per square meter than the aliens' original atmospheric processors. The success gave Jake confidence to attempt even more ambitious modifications. He began experimenting with creating different zones in the chamber, optimized for different functions. One area became dedicated to rapid moss growth, another to maximum oxygen production, and a third to moisture collection and distribution. Jake had been working for nearly 18 hours when he made his most important discovery yet. The moss wasn't just producing oxygen. It was also filtering other gases from the air and producing complex organic compounds. Some of these compounds seemed to have nutritional value, which meant his improvised ecosystem might eventually be able to sustain him indefinitely. He carefully tasted one of the compounds the moss was producing. It was sweet and slightly salty, with a texture like honey. Jake had no way to analyze its nutritional content, but his body seemed to respond positively to it. The aliens had provided no food, expecting him to die long before starvation became an issue. But Jake might have accidentally solved that problem as well. As he settled down to rest for the first time since the test began, Jake looked around his transformed chamber with satisfaction. The soft blue-green glow from dozens of moss patches created a peaceful atmosphere, and the steady hum of his electrical systems provided a comforting background noise. Jake had not only survived the first day of his test, he had thrived. 3 days had passed since Jake began his test, and the monitoring systems in the Zalani research facility were showing impossible readings. The atmospheric sensors indicated that not only was the human still alive, but the oxygen levels in his chamber were actually higher than when the test had started. Researcher Kethmar stood before the main observation screen, his pale gray features showing confusion that would have been impossible for humans to read. Around him, other Zilani scientists gathered to examine the data streaming from Jake's chamber. The readings made no sense according to their understanding of human physiology and survival capabilities. The subject should have expired 47 hours ago, announced research assistant Vel Khan, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that indicated scientific puzzlement. Human oxygen requirements are well documented. The atmospheric depletion rate reprogrammed should have been fatal within 18 to 20 hours. Kethmar manipulated the observation controls, switching the chamber's viewing mode to reveal the electromagnetic spectrum beyond normal human vision. What he saw made him pause. The chamber was glowing with bioelectric activity far beyond anything their original atmospheric system had produced. Complex electrical patterns flowed through, networks that definitely had not been present when the test began. Increase magnification on Sector 7, Kethmar ordered. The image zoomed in to show Jake sleeping peacefully in what could only be described as a garden. Patches of their atmospheric processing moss covered large sections of the chamber walls, but these patches were far more extensive and vibrant than anything in the original system design. How did the subject acquire additional biological material? Asked senior researcher Vekmore, her harmonic patterns indicating deep concern. Our security protocols should have prevented contamination of the test environment. Kethmar studied the electromagnetic readings more carefully. He did not acquire additional material. He cultivated it. Look at these electrical pathways. He highlighted the networks of improvised wiring that connected Jake's moss patches. The subject has created an integrated biological electrical system, using components from our own atmospheric processors. The observation team fell silent. In their thousands of years of testing various species, they had never encountered a subject who had not only survived their carefully designed trials, but had actually improved upon Zilani technology using nothing but improvised materials. Perhaps the human damaged our systems and is benefiting from malfunction, suggested Velkhan. We should examine the chamber's structural integrity. Kethmar was already running those diagnostics. The results showed that while Jake had indeed modified their systems, he had done so without damaging any critical components. Instead, he had somehow tapped into secondary circuits and redirected power in ways that enhanced the biological processes rather than disrupting them. The modifications are not malfunctions, Kethmar announced. They are improvements. The subject has increased atmospheric processing efficiency by approximately 37%, while reducing energy consumption by 12%. The implications of this discovery sent ripples of alarm through the research team. The Zalani had been using their current atmospheric processing technology for over 2 millennia. The idea that a primitive human could improve it in just 3 days, using scrap materials, challenged fundamental assumptions about technological superiority. We must inform the High Council immediately, declared Vekmore. If this human's adaptability is representative of his species, they pose a far greater threat than our initial assessments indicated. But Kethmar was examining additional data streams from the monitoring systems. Jake's vital signs showed remarkable stability. His heart rate and brain activity indicated that he was not under significant stress. If anything, he appeared to be thriving in the modified environment. "Wait," Kethmar said, studying readings from the chamber's internal sensors. "Look at these atmospheric composition reports. The subject is not merely surviving the test conditions. He has created an environment that is superior to standard Zilani life support specifications." The research team crowded around the data. Displays. The atmospheric readings showed optimal oxygen levels, perfect humidity, and trace amounts of beneficial organic compounds that were known to enhance cognitive function and physical well-being. Jake had accidentally created a better living environment than most Zilani enjoyed in their own habitats. "This is unprecedented," whispered Velkan. "No tested species has ever demonstrated such extreme environmental adaptability." Kethmar began reviewing historical data from thousands of previous tests. Species after species had failed the atmospheric depletion trial, usually within the predicted timeframes. Even the most adaptable creatures had managed only minor extensions of their survival time through conservation behaviors. None had ever turned the test environment to their advantage. "Perhaps we should increase the difficulty parameters," suggested Neckmore. "Reduce the chamber temperature or introduce atmospheric toxins to determine the subject's true limitations." But Kethmar was beginning to question whether finding Jake's limitations was the right approach. The humans' response to their test had revealed something unexpected about his species. They did not merely adapt to challenges. They transformed challenges into opportunities for improvement. "Observer team, prepare for direct contact protocols," Kethmar announced, making a decision that surprised his colleagues. "I want to communicate with the subject directly." "That violates standard testing procedures," Neckmore objected. "Direct contact could contaminate the results." "The results are already beyond our standard parameters," Kethmar replied. "This human has demonstrated capabilities that our models did not predict. We need to understand how his thought processes work, not just how long he can survive." Kethmar activated the chamber's communication system. Jake had been sleeping, but the soft chime that indicated an incoming message caused him to wake immediately. He sat up and looked around the chamber with alert eyes, showing no signs of the confusion or panic that most species displayed when contacted during testing. "Human Jake Morrison," Kethmar's translated voice echoed through the chamber. "I am Researcher Kethmar of the Zilani Collective. I wish to discuss your modifications to our atmospheric processing system." Jake stood up and walked to the viewport. He looked directly at the observation window, even though Kethmar knew the human could not see through the one-way barrier. "I figured someone was watching," Jake said calmly. "Your moss cultivation system was pretty impressive, but it had some efficiency issues. I hope you don't mind that I made a few improvements." The casual way Jake referred to advanced Zilani biotechnology as having efficiency issues sent another wave of surprise through the research team. Most species could barely comprehend their atmospheric systems, let alone identify ways to improve them. "You consider our technology inefficient?" Kethmar asked, genuinely curious about the human's perspective. "Not inefficient exactly," Jake replied, examining one of his mouse patches. "Just not optimized for the environment. You had the right idea with the bioelectric integration, but you weren't taking full advantage of the feedback loops. The moss actually wants to produce more oxygen than your original system was allowing." Kethmar realized that Jake understood their technology better than some Zilani engineers. 2 weeks had passed since Jake's test began, and what started as a survival trial had become the most important scientific discovery in Zilani history. Every day, Jake's improvised ecosystem became more sophisticated. He had created different zones within the chamber, each optimized for specific functions. Some areas focused on rapid moss growth, others on oxygen production, and still others on creating the organic compounds that were now providing him with basic nutrition. Kethmar visited the observation chamber every day, spending hours in conversation with Jake through the communication system. These talks had revealed something that challenged everything the Zilani believed about less advanced species. Jake was not just surviving or even adapting. He was innovating in real time, creating solutions that their own scientists had never considered. The feedback loop integration you suggested yesterday has improved our primary atmospheric processors by 23%, Kethmar announced during their daily conversation. Our engineering teams are implementing similar modifications throughout our research facility. Jake looked up from where he was tending to his latest moss cultivation experiment. That's great to hear. I've been thinking about your humidity control systems too. Have you considered using biological moisture sensors instead of electronic ones? The moss seems to respond to humidity changes faster than any mechanical system could. The casual way Jake offered improvements to technology that had taken the Zilani centuries to develop continued to amaze Kethmar. More importantly, every suggestion Jake made proved to be correct when tested. The humans' intuitive understanding of biological electrical integration was surpassing that of their most experienced engineers. Jake Morrison, Kethmar said, I must inform you that your test has exceeded all parameters. You were expected to survive perhaps one day. You have not only lived for 14 days, but have created an environment superior to our standard life. Support systems. Jake nodded as he adjusted the electrical current flowing to a new moss patch. I kind of figured this wasn't a normal survival situation when you started asking me for engineering advice. What was this really about? Kethmar paused, considering how much to reveal. Your species' rapid expansion into space concerned our leadership. We needed to determine whether humans would become a threat to galactic stability. These tests were designed to assess your people's limitations and problem-solving capabilities under extreme stress. And what's the verdict? Jake asked, though. His tone suggested he already suspected the answer. You have demonstrated that humans do not merely adapt to challenges, Kethmar replied. You transform challenges into opportunities for advancement. This capability, combined with your cooperative nature, suggests your species has remarkable potential as partners rather than threats. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of senior researcher Thekmor, whose harmonic patterns indicated urgent communication. Kethmar, the High Council has reached a decision regarding the human species. They request immediate termination of all tests and the implementation of containment protocols. Jake couldn't understand the alien language, but he could sense the tension in the room beyond his chamber. Is there a problem? He asked. Kethmar faced a decision that would affect not only Jake, but the future relationship between their species. The High Council's fear of human adaptability was understandable, but Kethmar had spent 2 weeks observing Jake's responses to challenges. The human's instinct was always to improve and share, never to dominate or destroy. There is disagreement among my people, Kethmar explained to Jake. Some believe your adaptability makes humans too dangerous to allow continued expansion. Others believe it makes you valuable potential allies. Jake was quiet for a moment, continuing to work with his moss while he thought. You know, back on Earth, we have a saying. You can judge people by how they treat those who can't help them. You've had me locked up for 2 weeks, and I've spent that time trying to help improve your technology. Does that tell you anything about humans? The simple wisdom of Jake's statement struck Kethmar with unexpected force. Despite being imprisoned and tested without his consent, Jake had shown no anger or desire for revenge. Instead, he had consistently offered assistance and improvements to his captor systems. Thekmor, Kethmar said, switching back to Zilani communication, inform the High Council that I am implementing emergency research protocols. This test subject has provided invaluable scientific data that requires immediate preservation and study. You cannot override a direct order from the High Council, Vecmore objected. I am not overriding anything, Kethmar replied. I am ensuring that critical research data is properly documented before any containment decisions are implemented. The Council will want complete information before making final determinations about the human species. What Kethmar was really doing was buying time to present Jake's achievements to the High Council in person. The data from the test was so remarkable that he believed it could change their entire perspective on humanity. Over the next 3 days, Kethmar compiled a comprehensive report on Jake's innovations. The improvements Jake had made to their atmospheric processing systems alone were worth decades of research development. More importantly, Jake had demonstrated a collaborative approach to problem-solving that suggested humans would be partners rather than conquerors in galactic civilization. When Kethmar finally appeared in person at Jake's chamber, the human immediately sensed that something significant was happening. The wall that had been seamless for 2 weeks suddenly opened, revealing the tall, gray-skinned alien that Jake had been talking to for so long. Jake Morrison, Kethmar said, I have an offer for you. My people's leadership wishes to meet with you directly. Your innovations have proven that humans possess capabilities we did not expect. We would like to discuss the possibility of your species joining our galactic community as partners. Jake looked around his transformed chamber one last time. The moss gardens he had created were thriving, producing clean air and organic nutrients. That could sustain him indefinitely. What had started as a desperate survival situation had become a comfortable living space. What about the other humans from my ship? Jake asked. They will be released and returned to Earth with an offer of formal diplomatic contact. Your captain will carry our invitation for peaceful relations between our species. Jake nodded and began gathering the few possessions he had brought into the chamber. As he prepared to leave, he paused at one of his most successful moss patches. You know, this whole experience has taught me something important, Jake said. When different species work together, they can create something better than either could manage alone. Maybe that's what the galaxy needs more of. Kethmar realized that Jake had summarized in one simple statement what it had taken the Zelani centuries to understand about cooperation and technological development. As they walked together toward the transport chamber, Kethmar felt optimistic about the future for the first time in decades. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their adaptability. It was their instinct to turn every challenge into an opportunity to build something better. The test had ended, but Jake's real work as Earth's first galactic ambassador was just beginning.